I still remember the sound of Colonel Stanton's voice echoing across the parade ground that morning at Fort Bragg. Lieutenant Emily Carter, dismissed. You are unfit for duty. The words tore through me louder than the rifles that had cracked during training. My knees locked, my salute frozen in the air as if my body refused to accept what my ears had heard. Around me, the unit shifted, uncomfortably, some whispering, some smirking, a few staring at me with pity. And then, to make sure the wound cut deeper, Stanton sneered, his voice low but audible enough. You've never been good enough to wear that uniform. The shame burned hotter than the Carolina sun. My throat closed, my chest ached, but I forced myself to turn sharply, collect my duffel, and walk away without letting my tears betray me. Hours later, I sat slumped in the corner booth of a rundown diner off the highway. My uniform was still on, though it felt like a costume now, a reminder of everything stripped from me. The coffee in front of me had gone cold. My hands trembled. That was when the chair across from me scraped loudly against the tile floor. I looked up. An elderly man with silver hair, sharp blue eyes, and the posture of someone who had lived a soldier's life, lowered himself into the booth. He studied me for a long moment, his gaze unwavering, and then he said something that froze me in place. You look just like my boy. They say the Army teaches you to adapt and overcome. What they don't tell you is that sometimes the enemy isn't across enemy lines. Sometimes it's standing right beside you in the same uniform. For me, that enemy was Colonel James Stanton, a man whose very presence demanded attention, whose voice could silence a room, and whose grudges could destroy careers. I never understood why he targeted me. Perhaps it was because I was one of the few female officers in our unit. Perhaps it was because I graduated top of my class at West Point. Or perhaps it was simply because I reminded him of something he didn't like about himself. Whatever the reason, from the moment I arrived at Fort Bragg 6 months ago, I felt his eyes boring into me, waiting for me to fail. Lieutenant Carter, your squad's time on the obstacle course was 30 seconds over standard. He'd bark, ignoring that 3 other squads had performed worse. Carter, that formation is sloppy. Do you even know what leadership looks like? Each day became a test. Not of my military skills, but of my resolve. I doubled down on my training, arriving before dawn to run extra miles, staying late to review tactical manuals, helping struggling soldiers in my unit improve their marksmanship. I refused to give him ammunition. Corporal Jason Mitchell often caught me during these late nights, my eyes burning from staring at field manuals. Lieutenant, you know you're already the best officer in the battalion, right? He'd say, leaning against the doorframe of the empty classroom I'd claimed. I'd shake my head, not looking up. Not according to Colonel Stanton. With all due respect, ma'am, the colonel's got issues that have nothing to do with you. Everyone knows it. But I couldn't accept that. In my family, excuses weren't allowed. My father had served 22 years. My grandfather had been at Normandy. The Carters didn't blame others for their failures. We fixed them. The day everything fell apart started like any other. Our unit was conducting a joint rescue exercise, a simulated hostage situation in an urban environment. My squad moved efficiently through the mock village, communicating through hand signals, covering each other as we advanced toward the target building. Everything was going according to plan until my radio malfunctioned just as we approached the final stage. Standard procedure dictated we should continue with our last known orders, which meant proceeding to secure the building. But as I signaled my team forward, Colonel Stanton's voice boomed across the training ground. Lieutenant Carter, hold position, he shouted, breaking protocol and potentially compromising our position. Your approach is all wrong. I froze, confused. My approach matched exactly what we'd been taught. My team looked to me, waiting for direction. In that split second of hesitation, the opposing force used our confusion to eliminate 3 of my soldiers. What the hell was that, Lieutenant? Stanton roared after the exercise, his face inches from mine. The entire battalion stood at attention, watching. You just got your men killed because you couldn't make a simple tactical decision. Sir, with respect, my radio malfunctioned and your interruption? Are you blaming me for your incompetence? His eyes narrowed dangerously. I swallowed hard. No, sir, but the manual clearly states, I don't give a damn what the manual states. A leader adapts. A leader doesn't freeze. He turned to address the entire formation. This is what happens when we lower standards, people. This is what happens when we prioritize diversity over competence. The words hit me like physical blows. I stood rigidly at attention, staring straight ahead, refusing to let the tears forming in my eyes fall. I could feel the pity from some of my fellow soldiers, the satisfaction from others who had resented my quick promotion. That night, I sat alone in my quarters, staring at a photo of my father in his dress uniform. What would he say if he could see me now? Would he be disappointed? Would he think Stanton was right? For the next 2 weeks, I was systematically excluded from tactical planning. My suggestions and briefings were ignored or dismissed. Junior officers who once sought my advice now avoided me in the mess hall. The whispers followed me everywhere. How I'd endangered my team, how I'd blamed the colonel for my mistakes, how I wasn't cut out for combat leadership. I wrote detailed reports, explaining the equipment malfunction, citing the exact procedures I had followed. I requested a formal review of the exercise. Each report came back denied, each with Colonel Stanton's signature at the bottom. Then came that fateful morning. The entire battalion stood in formation under the harsh Carolina sun. I knew something was wrong when I saw the general's aide standing beside Colonel Stanton, holding an official folder. Lieutenant Emily Carter. Front and aides. "Center!" Stanton called. I marched forward, each step feeling heavier than the last. The silence was deafening as I came to attention before him. "Lieutenant Carter, following a review of your performance and leadership capabilities, you are hereby relieved of command, effective immediately." His voice carried across the parade ground. "You have demonstrated a consistent inability to make sound, tactical judgments, a tendency to blame others for your failures, and a fundamental lack of the qualities required of an Army officer." I stood frozen, my mind refusing to process the words. "Lieutenant Emily Carter, dismissed. You are unfit for duty." As I turned to leave, I caught Corporal Mitchell's gaze. His fists were clenched at his sides, his jaw tight with anger. But like me, he was powerless. I walked away from the formation with whatever dignity I could muster, collected my duffel from my quarters, and left the base without saying goodbye to anyone. 5 generations of military service in my family ended with a public humiliation. And that's how I found myself hours later in that rundown diner off Highway 87, still in my uniform, staring into a cold cup of coffee as my world collapsed around me. The elderly man who sat across from me had weathered hands that had clearly known work and war. Deep lines mapped his face, but his eyes remained sharp, assessing me with an intensity that made me straighten my posture despite myself. "You don't need to do that," he said, noticing my instinctive reaction. "Not on my account." I relaxed slightly but kept my guard up. "Do I know you, sir?" "No." He shook his head slowly. "But I know that look. The look of someone who's just had everything they believe in pulled out from under them." I stared back at him, unsure whether to be offended or grateful for his directness. "Henry Lawson," he said, extending one of those weathered hands across the table. "Lieutenant Emily Carter," I replied automatically. Then winced. "Former lieutenant, I guess." "Once a soldier, always a soldier," Henry said firmly. "The uniform doesn't make the warrior." A waitress appeared, refilling my cold coffee without being asked, and taking Henry's order for black coffee and apple pie. When she left, we settled into a silence that wasn't entirely uncomfortable. "You said I look like your boy," I finally ventured. Henry's eyes clouded briefly. "Yes, something about the way you hold yourself. Proud even when you're beaten down." He paused. "My son, David, was a lieutenant too. 75th Ranger Regiment." I noted his use of past tense but didn't press. In the military, we learn quickly when not to ask certain questions. "I was just dismissed from service," I said instead, the words still bitter on my tongue. "Publicly. Humiliatingly." "I figured as much." Henry nodded toward my duffel bag. "Want to tell me why?" And surprisingly, I did. Maybe it was because he was a stranger, or maybe it was because he looked at me without judgment, something I hadn't experienced in months. The words spilled out. Colonel Stanton's targeted harassment, the sabotage training exercise, the systematic dismantling of my reputation. By the time I finished, my fresh coffee had gone cold too. Henry listened without interruption, his eyes occasionally flashing with something that looked like recognition. "Sounds familiar," he finally said, pushing his empty pie plate aside. "Some officers build themselves up by tearing others down. Been that way since armies were invented." "I just don't understand why me," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "I did everything right. I worked harder than anyone." "Sometimes that's exactly why," Henry said quietly. "Excellence is threatening to mediocre men in power." He reached into his jacket then, pulling out a small velvet case. For a moment, he just held it, rubbing his thumb across the surface as if gathering courage. Then he placed it on the table between us and slowly opened it. The Medal of Honor gleamed under the diner's fluorescent lights. My breath caught. It was the nation's highest and most revered military decoration, awarded for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, at the risk of life, above and beyond the call of duty. I had never seen one up close. "Is that yours?" I whispered, hardly daring to touch it. Henry shook his head. "My son's. Posthumous." The word hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. I waited, sensing there was more he wanted to say. "David's commanding officer was like your Colonel Stanton," Henry continued, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of old pain. "A man who saw my boy's talent as a threat rather than an asset. He assigned David the most dangerous missions, excluded him from strategic planning, wrote him up for imaginary infractions." My throat tightened as the parallels to my own situation became clear. "What happened?" I asked, though part of me already knew. "A hostage rescue in Afghanistan went sideways. David was the junior officer, but he had spotted a flaw in the operation plan. His CO dismissed his concerns. When they encountered heavy resistance exactly where David had predicted, the team was pinned down. Without hesitation, David created a diversion that allowed his team and the hostages to escape, even though it meant certain death for himself." Henry's fingers trembled slightly as he touched the medal. His teammates told me afterward that his last words were, "Tell them I was fit for duty." The phrase hit me like a physical blow, mirroring Stanton's cruel dismissal. I couldn't speak. The Army conducted an investigation. David's CO was relieved of command when they discovered he had ignored intelligence reports that supported David's concerns. The medal came a year later. Henry closed the case gently. Too late for my boy to know he was vindicated. "I'm so sorry," I managed to say, feeling the inadequacy of the words. Henry looked up at me, his gaze intensifying. "Emily, my son died proving his worth to a man who never deserved his loyalty. Don't make the same mistake. What choice do I have? My career is over. Your career in the Army might be. Your life as a warrior isn't." He pushed the velvet case toward me. "I want you to have this." I recoiled as if he'd offered me a live grenade. "Sir, I can't possibly—" "Not to keep," he clarified. "To remember. To carry with you what it represents." "I don't understand." "The truth, Lieutenant Carter, is that they didn't dismiss you because you're unfit for duty." His voice gained strength. "They dismissed you because you're more fit than they could handle." Those words, those 5 words, "you're more fit than they could handle," seemed to reverberate through the diner. For the first time since walking off base, I felt something other than shame. Something that felt dangerously like hope. That medal represents something that no superior officer can take away from you. The courage to stand by your principles, even when it costs you everything. Henry's eyes never left mine. David paid the ultimate price for his integrity. Don't let them take yours. A tear finally escaped, rolling down my cheek. Unchecked. What am I supposed to do now? Henry Lawson straightened in his seat, and for a moment, I could see the soldier he had once been. You fight back. Not with anger or vengeance, but with truth. Henry and I stayed in that diner until closing time. Over the course of 5 hours, he told me about his son David's life, his own military career in Vietnam, and the painful aftermath of David's, death. What struck me most was how he channeled his grief into advocacy for junior officers facing institutional bullying. As the waitress signaled they were closing, Henry wrote his phone number on a napkin. "I have a few calls to make," he said, sliding the napkin across to me. "Where are you staying tonight?" I hadn't thought that far ahead. "I don't know." He nodded, not judging. "There's a decent motel down the road. Get some rest. I'll pick you up tomorrow at noon." I wanted to ask why, what he was planning, but the certainty in his voice gave me a stability I desperately needed. So instead, I just nodded. That night, in a motel room with peeling wallpaper and a mattress that had seen better days, I finally let myself break down. I sobbed until my throat was raw, until my body ached from the force of it. Years of pushing myself to perfection, of honoring my family legacy, of believing that merit would always triumph, all of it shattered in a single morning by Colonel Stanton's vindictive dismissal. When the tears finally stopped, I lay staring at the water stains on the ceiling, Henry's words echoing. "They dismissed you because you're more fit than they could handle." Was that true? Or just something kind an old man said to a broken soldier? Morning came with no answers, just a dull headache and swollen eyes. I showered, put my uniform back on because I had nothing else to wear, and waited for Henry in the motel parking lot. At exactly noon, a weathered blue pickup truck pulled in, Henry at the wheel. "Get in, Lieutenant," he called through the open window. "We've got work to do." The drive took us back toward Fort Bragg, which made my stomach clench with anxiety. But instead of heading to the base, Henry pulled into the parking lot of the Fayetteville Observer, the local newspaper. "What are we doing here?" I asked, panic rising in my throat. "Meeting an old friend," Henry replied cryptically, leading me into the building. That friend turned out to be Martin Wells, a veteran journalist with salt and pepper hair and reading glasses perched on his nose. His office was cluttered with decades of newspaper clippings, awards, and photographs, many showing Martin in various war zones with soldiers. "Hank," Martin greeted warmly, standing to shake Henry's hand before turning to me. "And you must be Lieutenant Carter." My surprise must have shown on my face because Henry chuckled. "I called Martin last night. He's been covering military affairs for 30 years. Knows more about what happens on base than most of the officers stationed there." Martin gestured for us to sit. "Henry tells me you've had a rough go with Colonel Stanton." "That's putting it mildly," I replied. "You're not the first," Martin said, pulling a file from his desk drawer. He spread several papers before me, letters, emails, even handwritten notes. "I've been collecting testimonies about Stanton for years. He's got a pattern of targeting promising officers, especially women and minorities, creating impossible situations, then using the inevitable fallout to discredit them." I read through the documents with growing astonishment. There were at least a dozen. Cases similar to mine. Officers with exemplary records suddenly deemed unfit for duty after crossing paths with Stanton. "Why hasn't anything been done?" I demanded. Martin sighed. "Military hierarchy, fear of retaliation. Most of his victims just want to move on with their lives. And Stanton's got friends in high places, including General Phillips, the same general who allowed my dismissal." I said bitterly. "The very same," Henry confirmed. "But here's where it gets interesting." He nodded to Martin. Martin pulled up an email on his computer, turning the screen so I could read it. "This came in this morning from an anonymous source on base, someone calling themselves Loyal Soldier." The email contained detailed information about my dismissal, but with critical context that had been omitted from the official record. It mentioned the radio malfunction, confirmed by equipment logs. It referenced Colonel Stanton's breach of protocol during the exercise. Most damning of all, it included transcript excerpts from a meeting where Stanton had explicitly stated his intention to make an example of Carter weeks before the incident that led to my dismissal. "Corporal Mitchell," I whispered, recognizing phrases that only he would know. "Whoever it is, they've taken a huge risk," Martin said, "but it's not enough on its own. I'd need corroboration, preferably from someone willing to go on record." Henry and I exchanged glances. "What would happen if you publish this?" I asked. "Best case? The Army conducts an internal investigation, finds impropriety in your dismissal, and, you're reinstated with an apology and back pay." Martin removed his glasses, polishing them thoughtfully. "Worst case? The story gets buried, Stanton denies everything, and whoever leaked this information faces disciplinary action." "And what about me?" My voice sounded small even to my own ears. "You'd be putting yourself in the spotlight," Martin said honestly. "Taking on a powerful man with powerful friends. It would be easier to just walk away, find a civilian job, start over." The room fell silent. In that moment, I thought about my father and grandfather, about their unwavering belief in the institution I had just been cast out from. I thought about David Lawson, dying with those words on his lips. Tell them I was fit for duty. And I thought about all the other officers in Martin's file, their careers cut short by the same man who had destroyed mine. "If I walk away," I said slowly, "Stanton wins. Not just against me, but against everyone who comes after me." Henry's weathered hand covered mine. "That's my girl." Martin nodded, a new respect in his eyes. "Then let's get to work." Over the next few hours, I gave Martin my full statement. Every instance of Stanton's targeted behavior, every questionable order, every manipulated report. I handed over my copies of the performance evaluations that had mysteriously changed between my submission and the official record. The entire time, a voice in the back of my mind screamed that I was committing career suicide, that I should just accept my dismissal and move on. But another voice, stronger and clearer, reminded me of what I'd been taught since childhood. Carters don't back down from what's right. As evening approached, Martin leaned back in his chair. I'll need a day or two to verify what I can and prepare the article. In the meantime, keep a low profile. As we left the newspaper office, I felt simultaneously lighter and more terrified than I had since my dismissal. Henry must have sensed it because as we walked to his truck, he said, "Second thoughts?" "About a million of them," I admitted. "What if we're wrong? What if this just makes everything worse?" Henry stopped, turning to face me fully. "Emily, let me tell you something I learned in Vietnam. There are two kinds of courage. There's the kind that lets you run into gunfire to save your buddies. That's instinct, adrenaline. Then there's the kind that lets you stand up and tell the truth when everyone wants you to stay quiet. That's character." He placed his hands on my shoulders, his blue eyes intense. "You've already proven you have the first kind. Now you're proving you have the second." That night, I stayed at Henry's modest home on the outskirts of Fayetteville. We ate takeout Chinese food while he showed me old photographs of David. The resemblance between father and son was striking. Same sharp blue eyes, same determined jaw. In one photo, David stood proudly in his dress uniform, the same determination in his eyes that I recognized from Henry. "He would have been 40 next month," Henry said softly, touching the photo with gentle fingers. "I'm sorry," I said, meaning it more deeply than words could express. Henry shook his head. "Don't be sorry. Be worthy." He looked up at me. "That's why I approached you in that diner, you know. Not just because you reminded me of him, but because I saw in you what I saw in him. Someone who wouldn't stay down when knocked down." As I prepared to sleep on Henry's couch that night, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. My heart raced as I read it. "Lieutenant, Carter, it's Mitchell. They're saying things about you that aren't true. I've got proof. Not alone in this. Be careful who you trust. We'll be in touch." I showed Henry the message, a mixture of hope and fear swirling inside me. "The truth is gathering momentum," he said with grim satisfaction. "Sleep well, Lieutenant. Tomorrow we continue the fight." The next morning, I woke to the sound of Henry's phone ringing. Through the thin walls of his small house, I could hear his gruff voice answering, then a sharp intake of breath. Immediately alert, I sat up on the couch, my senses tuned to the tension in his voice. "When?" he was saying. "How many?" "Yes, she's here. I understand. We'll be ready." He appeared in the doorway, already dressed in jeans and a button-down shirt, his expression grave. "That was Martin. The story's blown wide open. Multiple soldiers from your unit have come forward independently, corroborating everything you said about Stanton." My heart leapt. "That's good news, isn't it?" "Yes and no," Henry said, pouring coffee into 2 mugs and handing me one. "It means Martin can publish with confidence. But it also means word has gotten back to base. Stanton knows something's coming." A cold dread settled in my stomach. What does that mean for us? It means we need to move quickly. Martin's running the story in tomorrow's paper, but he's giving us a heads up. Stanton's been making calls all morning, including to the general. There's a closed-door meeting happening at the base right now. I took a long swallow of coffee, scalding my tongue but barely, noticing. "So, what's our next move?" Henry's eyes glinted with a strategic sharpness that reminded me he had once commanded men in combat. "We make sure the right people see that story before Stanton can control the narrative." He reached for his phone, scrolling through contacts before making another call. "Colonel Matthews? Henry Lawson." "Yes, sir. It's been a while." "Listen, I need to call in. That favor you owe me." Over the next hour, I watched in amazement as Henry Lawson, who I'd first taken for just a grieving father, activated what could only be described as a network of military contacts spanning multiple branches and ranks. Retired generals, active duty officers, Pentagon officials, all of them taking his calls, listening as he briefly outlined the situation. "Who exactly are you?" I finally asked when he ended his last call. Henry gave a modest shrug. "Just an old soldier who's been around long enough to know how the system works, and how to work around it when necessary." A knock at the door interrupted us. Henry checked through the peephole before opening it, revealing a nervous-looking Corporal Mitchell. He was in civilian clothes, jeans and a t-shirt, but his military bearing was unmistakable. "Lieutenant Carter," he said, relief washing over his face when he saw me. "You're okay." "Mitchell?" I responded, fighting the urge to hug him. "What are you doing here? How did you find me?" "Mr. Wells at the newspaper told me where to find you," he explained, stepping inside and glancing around anxiously. "I had to warn you in person. Things are crazy back at base. Stanton's on the warpath. He knows something's coming, and he's trying to get ahead of it." "How?" Henry asked sharply. Mitchell pulled out his phone, showing us a base-wide email sent that morning. It described me as emotionally unstable, suggested I had fabricated claims of equipment malfunction to cover for tactical errors, and warned all personnel against speaking to the media about all internal disciplinary matters. It gets worse, Mitchell continued, swiping to show us more. He's pulled your entire personnel file, doctoring evaluations, adding infractions that never happened. I saw him and Major Lewis working on it last night in the command office. My fists clenched. They're rewriting history. They're trying to, Henry corrected, but they're too late. Martin has testimony from how many, Corporal? 7 of us so far, Mitchell said with quiet pride. Myself, Sergeant Rodriguez, Specialist Chen, Lieutenant Wilson. He listed names of soldiers I had worked with, trained with, respected. We all gave statements about what really happened during that exercise and about Stanton's behavior toward you over the past months. Emotion welled in my throat. You all risked your careers for me. Mitchell's eyes were steady. We risked our careers for the truth, ma'am. Same as you would have done for any of us. Henry's phone buzzed with a text. Martin says the article's finalized. It runs first thing tomorrow. He looked up. That gives Stanton about 18 hours to try to contain the damage. What will he do in that time, Corporal? Mitchell considered. He'll call in favors, pressure witnesses to recant, probably try to get the general to issue some kind of statement backing him before the story breaks. Then we need to get to the general first, I said decisively. Henry and Mitchell exchanged glances. Lieutenant, Mitchell said carefully, General Phillips is firmly in Stanton's corner. He signed off on your dismissal without even reviewing the evidence. That was before he knew there were witnesses willing to go on record, I countered. Before he knew there was documentation of equipment failure. Before he knew a journalist was about to make it all public. I stood straighter, feeling more like an officer than I had since my dismissal. He needs to hear the truth from me directly, before Stanton's version is the only one he knows. Henry studied me thoughtfully. It's risky. If Phillips shuts you down and alerts Stanton that you're making moves, it could backfire. And if he listens, even for a minute, I challenged, if he has even a sliver of doubt about Stanton's integrity, isn't that worth the risk? After a moment of tense silence, Henry nodded. It's your call, Lieutenant. Your battle to fight. Not alone, Mitchell said firmly. I'm with you. As am I, Henry added. For the first time since walking off that parade ground in disgrace, I felt something like my old confidence returning, not because I believed in the system anymore, but because I believed in these men standing with me, in the other soldiers who had spoken up, and in myself. Then let's plan this properly, I said, every inch the tactical officer I had been trained to be. If we're going to confront the general, we need to be strategic. Over the next few hours, the 3 of us mapped out our approach. Mitchell provided critical intelligence about the general's schedule. He would be leaving a budget meeting at 1600 hours, with a 30-minute window before his next appointment. Henry made calls to ensure the general's administrative assistant, a retired master sergeant who owed Henry a favor, would not alert Stanton to our presence. I prepared what I would say, concise, factual, unemotional. As the afternoon sun began its descent, we drove toward Fort Bragg in Henry's pickup. The sight of the base entrance made my stomach clench, memories of my humiliation still fresh. Mitchell, now back in uniform, would enter. First, to confirm the general's location. Henry would wait in the truck as our backup. Remember, Henry said as we parked, no matter what happens in there, you've already won the most important battle, the one for your integrity. I nodded, took a deep breath, and straightened my civilian clothes, the only outfit I had, borrowed from Henry's late wife's closet. A simple blouse and slacks. Nothing. Like the uniform I had worn with such pride. Ready, Lieutenant? Mitchell asked. I looked at him, then at Henry, drawing strength from their confidence in me. Ready, Corporal. Let's go face the storm. Returning to Fort Bragg felt like walking into a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. Though I wore civilian clothes, soldiers still recognized me, their expressions ranging from surprise to sympathy to embarrassment as they quickly averted their eyes. Word of my dismissal had clearly spread throughout the base. Mitchell walked slightly ahead of me, his presence both a guide and a shield. We had timed our arrival carefully, knowing the general would be crossing from the administration building to his office following the budget meeting. The plan was simple. Intercept him in the open, where a scene would be harder to contain. There he is, Mitchell murmured, nodding toward the far side of the quad. General Phillips was a tall, imposing figure with iron-gray hair and the erect posture of a career military man. He walked briskly, flanked by 2 aides carrying folders. In that moment, my courage nearly failed me. This was the man who had allowed my dismissal without question, who had the power to destroy what remained of my reputation with a single word. "It's now or never, ma'am," Mitchell said quietly. Drawing a deep breath, I stepped forward. "General Phillips!" My voice rang out across the quad, turning heads. The general paused, scanning for the source of the call. When his eyes found me, I saw a flash of recognition, then confusion. "Lieutenant Carter?" He frowned, glancing at his aides, who looked equally perplexed by my presence. I approached with measured steps, maintaining eye contact. "General Phillips, I need 5 minutes of your time. It's regarding my dismissal and Colonel Stanton." His expression hardened. "Your dismissal was processed through proper channels, Lieutenant. If you have a grievance, there are procedures." "The procedures were corrupted, sir," I interrupted, something I would never have dared do in uniform. "I have evidence that Colonel Stanton deliberately sabotaged my training exercise and falsified reports leading to my dismissal." The general's eyes narrowed. "That's a serious accusation." "Yes, sir, which is why the Fayetteville Observer is running a front-page story on it tomorrow morning, with testimony from 7 soldiers in my former unit." That got his attention. His gaze flicked briefly to Mitchell, who stood at parade rest just behind me, then back to me. After a moment of tense consideration, he turned to his aides. "Give us a moment." They retreated a respectful distance, though not far enough to be out of earshot. The general's voice dropped to a near whisper. "Explain yourself, Carter. Quickly." I had rehearsed this moment with Henry and Mitchell, distilling weeks of injustice into the most compelling 2-minute summary possible. I outlined the equipment malfunction, documented in the maintenance logs but omitted from official reports. I described Stanton's pattern of targeted harassment, confirmed by multiple witnesses. I mentioned the meeting transcripts where Stanton had explicitly stated his intention to make an example of me. Throughout my recitation, General Phillips's expression remained unreadable, his eyes cold and assessing. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. "Why come to me now?" he finally asked. "Why not through official channels?" "Because Colonel Stanton controls those channels, sir. Because I tried to file reports that were buried. Because right now he's in his office altering my personnel records to discredit me before the story breaks." The general's eyes widened slightly at this last claim. "You can prove that?" "Corporal Mitchell can," I said, gesturing to my loyal soldier. "He witnessed it firsthand last night." Mitchell stepped forward. "It's true, sir. I saw Colonel Stanton and Major Lewis modifying Lieutenant Carter's file after hours. They were adding infractions that never occurred." For the first time, I saw uncertainty flicker across General Phillips's face. He was a career military man, and whatever his personal feelings about me or his relationship with Stanton, tampering with official records crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. "The story runs tomorrow," I continued, pressing my advantage. 7 soldiers on the record, plus documentation of the equipment failure and procedural violations. How will it look for the base? For you, sir, when it comes out that these allegations were brought directly to your attention and ignored? It was a calculated risk, bordering on insubordination, even though I was technically no longer under his command. The general's jaw tightened, but instead of the anger I expected, I saw something else in his eyes. Calculation. "Wait here," he said abruptly, then strode toward the administration building, leaving his aides looking confused. Mitchell and I exchanged glances. "What do you think that means?" he asked. "I don't know," I admitted, my heart pounding. But he didn't dismiss us outright. That's something. We stood in tense silence for nearly 15 minutes, drawing curious looks from soldiers passing through the quad. I fought the urge to check my phone, to call Henry and update him. Just as I was beginning to think the general had simply walked away to avoid dealing with us, the door to the administration building opened. General Phillips emerged, followed by a woman in civilian clothes whom I recognized as the base's legal counsel, and a stern-looking officer from the Inspector General's office. The general's face was grim as he approached us. "Lieutenant Carter, Corporal Mitchell, come with me." His tone left no room for argument. He led us to a conference room in the administration building where, to my shock, Colonel Stanton was already seated, along with Major Lewis and several other senior officers. Stanton's face darkened with fury when he saw me. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, rising halfway from his chair. "Why is this civilian on base? She has no authorization." "Sit down, Colonel." The general's voice cracked like a whip. Lieutenant Carter is here at my invitation. That statement, so simple yet so powerful, sent a ripple through the room. Stanton slowly lowered himself back into his chair, his eyes never leaving my face. General Phillips gestured for Mitchell and me to sit at the far end of the table, away from Stanton. The legal counsel and the IG officer took positions at opposite sides. I've called this emergency meeting, the general began, because serious allegations have been brought to my attention regarding Lieutenant Carter's dismissal. Allegations that, if true, constitute violations of military code and potentially federal law. Stanton's face remained impassive, but I could see a vein pulsing at his temple. General, with respect, this woman was dismissed for cause. Her accusations are clearly retaliatory. We'll determine that, Colonel. The IG officer interrupted. I've reviewed the maintenance logs from the day of the exercise in question. They do indeed show a malfunction in Lieutenant Carter's radio equipment. Major Lewis shifted uncomfortably. Those logs can be misinterpreted. And I suppose the meeting transcript where Colonel Stanton explicitly stated his intention to make an example of Carter weeks before the incident can also be misinterpreted? The legal counsel asked, sliding a document across the table. The room fell silent. Stanton's face had gone pale, his eyes darting between the document and General Phillips. Where did you get that? He finally managed. It was anonymously delivered to my office this afternoon, the general replied coldly, along with copies of Lieutenant Carter's original performance evaluations, before they were altered. I sat in stunned silence. This wasn't just about my testimony anymore, or even the newspaper story. Someone else, someone high enough in the chain of command to have access to meeting transcripts, had been gathering evidence against Stanton all along. Furthermore, the general continued, I've spoken with Sergeant Rodriguez, who confirms that he was instructed by Colonel Stanton to provide substandard equipment to Lieutenant Carter's squad during the exercise. Stanton exploded. This is absurd! A conspiracy of disgruntled subordinates! 7 subordinates, Colonel. The general cut him off. All with exemplary records. All willing to testify under oath. Plus documentation that you've been tampering with official records. The meeting continued for another 2 hours. Mitchell and I were questioned extensively, our statements recorded by the legal counsel. Other soldiers were called in to testify, including, to my surprise, several who had never particularly supported me, but who nonetheless confirmed specific instances of Stanton's targeting behavior. Throughout it all, I maintained my composure, answering questions factually and without emotion, just as Henry had advised. Stanton, by contrast, grew increasingly agitated, his denials more vehement, his accusations more desperate. As the meeting drew to a close, General Phillips stood. Based on the evidence presented, I am ordering an immediate investigation by the Inspector General's office. Colonel Stanton, you are temporarily relieved of command pending the outcome of this investigation. Major Lewis, you will also be investigated for your role in falsifying records. Stanton's face contorted with rage. You can't do this. On the word of a dismissed officer and a handful of enlisted men, this is outrageous. What's outrageous, Colonel? The general replied coldly, is that this happened under my command without my knowledge. That ends today. He turned to me. Lieutenant Carter, while I cannot reinstate you immediately, your dismissal is suspended pending the investigation's outcome. You will be placed on administrative leave with full pay. The words washed over me like a wave, too overwhelming to fully process. After everything, the humiliation, the despair, the fight to reclaim my honor, this simple acknowledgement felt almost unreal. As we were dismissed, Stanton brushed past me, his voice low and venomous. This isn't over, Carter. I met his gaze steadily. No, sir. For you, it's just beginning. Word spreads quickly on a military base. By the time Mitchell and I exited the administration building, rumors were already circulating about Colonel Stanton being relieved of command and an investigation into my dismissal. Soldiers I had served with approached cautiously, some offering quiet congratulations, others simply nodding in recognition that something momentous had occurred. Henry was waiting in his truck outside the main gate, practically jumping out when he saw us approaching. Well? He demanded, searching our faces for clues. They suspended my dismissal, I said, the reality of it finally sinking in. Stanton's been temporarily relieved of command pending an investigation. Henry's weathered face broke into a broad smile. He clasped my shoulders, his eyes bright with emotion. I knew it. I knew they couldn't ignore the truth forever. Mitchell grinned. You should have seen her in there, sir. Stood her ground like she was facing down enemy fire. Let's not celebrate too soon, I cautioned, though I couldn't keep the smile from my face. The investigation could take weeks, and Stanton has friends in high places. He also has enemies in high places. Apparently, Mitchell remarked, someone's been collecting evidence against him for months. General Phillips already had meeting transcripts, original copies of your evaluations. Henry's expression turned thoughtful. Stanton's made a career of stepping on others to climb the ladder. Seems like someone finally decided to kick it out from under him. We returned to Henry's house, where I called Martin at the newspaper to update him on the day's events. He was delighted but unsurprised. The story still runs tomorrow, he confirmed, but with an updated headline, Fort Bragg, Colonel relieved amid allegations of misconduct. The general's prompt action will be noted favorably. Smart move on his part, Henry commented after I hung up. Gets ahead of the story, makes it look like he's been in control all along rather than caught off guard. Do you think that's why he acted so quickly? I asked. Just damage control? Henry shrugged. Does it matter? You got what you wanted, a fair investigation. I pondered that as we ate a celebratory dinner of takeout pizza. Was it enough to have my dismissal suspended? To see Stanton temporarily removed? Part of me still burned with the injustice of it all. The weeks of targeted harassment, the public humiliation, the stain on my record that might never fully disappear even if I was ultimately vindicated. As if reading my thoughts, Mitchell said, "What will you do, Lieutenant? If they reinstate you?" The question caught me off guard. I had been so focused on clearing my name that I hadn't seriously considered what came next. Would I return? To a unit where some had stood by me, but others had believed the worst? Could I serve under General Phillips, knowing he had initially accepted Stanton's assessment without question? I don't know, I admitted. What about you? Aren't you worried about fallout from all this? Mitchell shook his head. I did what was right. Whatever comes, I can live with that. His simple conviction reminded me of why I had joined the Army in the first place. Not just for the family legacy, but because I believed in standing for something greater than myself. The following morning, Martin's article dominated the front page of the Fayetteville Observer. It was comprehensive, detailing Stanton's pattern of targeted harassment, the falsified reports, and the brave soldiers who had come forward. The piece also highlighted the Army's swift response, noting that an investigation had already been launched. Nice spin, Henry remarked, reading over my shoulder. Makes everyone look good except Stanton. And Major Lewis, I added, noting the prominent mention of his role in altering records. My phone rang shortly after breakfast, an unknown number that turned out to be General Phillips's assistant. The General requests your presence at his office at 1100 hours, Ms. Carter. The formal address, neither lieutenant nor my full former title, reflected my current limbo status. Still, the summons sent a flutter of anxiety through me. Do you want me to come with you? Henry offered. I shook my head. No. This time I need to stand alone. I borrowed Henry's truck and drove to the base, my civilian, clothes still feeling strange after years in uniform. At the gate, I was issued a visitor's pass without question, the MPs clearly expecting me. General Phillips's office was as austere as the man himself. No personal photos, just military commendations and a large map of global Army deployments on the wall. He rose when I entered, gesturing for me to sit across from his desk. Thank you for coming, Carter. He studied me for a moment before continuing. You've created quite a stir. That wasn't my intention, sir. Wasn't it? He raised an eyebrow. The newspaper article, the coordinated testimony, the precisely timed confrontation, that shows tactical planning worthy of a field officer. I remained silent, unsure if I was being complimented or accused. I've received calls from the Pentagon this morning, he continued. The Secretary of the Army himself is concerned about the appearance of systemic misconduct at Fort Bragg. I'm sorry if this has created difficulties for you, sir, I said carefully. The general leaned back in his chair. Do you know why I approved your dismissal, Carter? Colonel Stanton's recommendation? Yes, but why did I trust it? He didn't wait for my answer. Because Stanton has produced results for 20 years. His units perform exceptionally in the field. His tactical assessments have proven correct time and again. When someone like that tells me an officer is unfit for duty, I listen. He stood, moving to the window that overlooked the parade ground where I had been publicly dismissed. What I failed to consider was the cost of those results. How many promising careers ended prematurely? How many soldiers were used as stepping stones for his advancement? It wasn't just me, I asked, though I already knew the answer from Martin's research. No, the investigation has only just begun. But already we've identified at least 15 officers over the past decade whose careers were derailed after crossing paths with Stanton. Disproportionately women and minorities, as you might expect. He turned back to face me. I bear responsibility for that. I prioritized results over integrity. I failed to question a pattern that should have been obvious. His frank admission stunned me. I had expected defensiveness, perhaps a grudging acknowledgement of Stanton's misconduct, but not this level of self-reflection from a general. The Inspector General's preliminary finding is that your dismissal was improper and based on falsified information, he continued. You will be fully reinstated with back pay and a formal apology. All negative materials will be expunged from your record. Relief washed through me, but it was tempered by the knowledge that the damage to my reputation couldn't be so easily erased. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me, Carter. I failed you. Thank those soldiers who risked their careers to speak the truth. Thank that journalist who pursued the story. Thank Henry Lawson, who I understand played no small part in all this. I started in surprise. You know Henry? Everyone who served in Vietnam knows the Lawsons. Henry and his son David were legends in their own way. The general's expression softened slightly. David's death was a tragedy that should never have happened. A commander ignored critical intelligence because it came from a junior officer he disliked. Sound familiar? The parallel to my own situation was chilling. If Stanton had his way, would I have eventually found myself in a similarly dangerous position? My concerns dismissed, my assessments ignored. Henry recognized the pattern because he's lived with its consequences, the general continued. When he started making calls yesterday, people listened, including me. So it had been Henry behind those mysteriously appearing documents, leveraging his network of military contacts to ensure the investigation couldn't be easily buried. I felt a surge of gratitude for the gruff old veteran who had recognized something in me worth fighting for. There's one more thing, General Phillips said, reaching into his desk drawer. He withdrew a small box and placed it between us. Open it. Inside was a set of lieutenant bars, identical to the ones I had worn before my dismissal, yet somehow imbued with new meaning after everything that had happened. Your official reinstatement ceremony will be tomorrow at 0900. Same. Parade ground. Same formation. His gaze was steady. It won't erase what happened, but it's a start. As I drove back to Henry's house, the box with my lieutenant bars resting on the passenger seat, I reflected on the extraordinary turn of events. From dismissed and disgraced to reinstated and vindicated in just a few days. The injustice hadn't broken me. Instead, with help from unexpected allies, it had revealed a strength I hadn't known I possessed. Henry was waiting on his porch when I pulled up, his expression anxious until he saw my smile. Good news? I held up the box containing my bars. I'm being reinstated, officially tomorrow morning. His face lit up with genuine joy. I knew it. They couldn't ignore the truth once it was right in front of them. He pulled me into an unexpected hug, his voice gruff with emotion. David would have been proud to know you. Coming from Henry, there could be no higher praise. The morning of my reinstatement ceremony dawned clear and bright, the late summer sun already warming the Carolina air as Henry and I drove toward Fort Bragg. We had spent the previous evening talking late into the night about David, about the Army, about what it meant to serve with honor. When I finally went to bed on Henry's couch, it was with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. Nervous? Henry asked as we approached the main gate. A little, I admitted. It's not every day you get publicly dismissed and then publicly reinstated in the same week. He chuckled, then grew serious. Whatever happens in there, remember, you've already won the battle. That matters. The MPs at the gate recognized me immediately, offering respectful nods as they waved us through. Instead of the visitor's pass I'd worn yesterday, I was handed my military ID card, restored to active status overnight. The simple plastic card felt weighty in my hands, a tangible symbol of my return. Henry parked near the administration building. I'll wait here, he said. This is your moment. I hesitated, my hand on the door handle. Would you come with me? Stand at the back of the formation? It would mean a lot. His blue eyes softened. Nothing would make me prouder. Inside, I found Corporal Mitchell waiting in the hallway outside the locker room. His face broke into a wide grin when he saw me. Lieutenant, you're early. Old habits, I said with a smile. Is everything set? Yes, ma'am. The entire battalion will be assembled at 0900. General Phillips will make the announcement personally. I nodded, taking a deep breath. And Colonel Stanton? Mitchell's expression hardened slightly. Officially on administrative leave pending investigation. Word is he's lawyered up, claiming he's being scapegoated. That didn't surprise me. Men like Stanton rarely accepted responsibility, even when confronted with irrefutable evidence of their misconduct. And the unit? How are they taking everything? Mixed, Mitchell admitted. Most are supportive, especially those who knew what was really happening. A few are keeping their distance, worried about being caught in the fallout. And then there's Stanton's loyalists, who blame me for taking down their mentor. I finished for him. Yes, ma'am, but they're the minority. I considered this as I changed into my uniform in the locker room. The fabric felt both familiar and strange against my skin, like returning to a childhood home after years away. When I pinned my lieutenant bars to my collar, my fingers trembled slightly. So much weight for such small pieces of metal. At precisely 0855, I stepped onto the same parade ground where, days earlier, I had been stripped of my rank and dignity. The battalion was already forming up, soldiers falling into ordered rows with the precision that comes from countless hours of drill. From the corner of my eye, I saw Henry taking a position at the back of the gathering, standing tall despite his age, the bearing of a lifelong soldier evident in his posture. Sergeant Major Coleman approached me, his weathered face unreadable. Lieutenant Carter. Sergeant Major. I returned his greeting, uncertainty creeping in. Coleman had been notably absent from the list of soldiers who had spoken up for me. To my surprise, he extended his hand. "Welcome back, ma'am." The simple gesture from a man whose approval was notoriously hard to earn nearly undid me. I shook his hand firmly, not trusting my voice. "Your position is up front, to the general's right," he continued, professional as ever. "He'll call you forward when it's time." At 0900 exactly, General Phillips strode onto the field, his presence commanding immediate attention. The battalion snapped to attention, hundreds of soldiers moving as one. "At ease," the general ordered, his voice carrying across the parade ground. Then, without preamble, he began. 3 days ago, on this very ground, a grave injustice was perpetrated. An officer with an exemplary record was publicly dismissed based on falsified reports and manipulated evidence. That officer stood here before you, enduring humiliation with the dignity and strength that exemplifies the best of the United States Army. A ripple went through the formation as soldiers exchanged glances, the general's blunt acknowledgement catching many by surprise. Today, we begin to correct that injustice. Following an investigation by the Inspector General's office, it has been determined that Lieutenant Emily Carter's dismissal was improper and based on deliberately falsified information. Lieutenant Carter, front and center. My heart pounding, I stepped forward, marching to the position directly in front of General Phillips. I came to attention, saluting crisply. "Lieutenant Emily Carter, by the authority vested in me by the United States Army, I hereby reinstate you to full active duty with all rights and privileges thereof, effective immediately. Furthermore, in recognition of the moral courage demonstrated throughout this ordeal, I am awarding you the Army Commendation Medal." This unexpected addition drew murmurs from the assembled soldiers. The Army Commendation Medal was typically awarded for acts of valor or meritorious service, not for standing up to institutional injustice. As the general pinned the medal to my uniform, he spoke quietly, for my ears only. "This doesn't make it right, but it's a start." I maintained my composure, though emotion threatened to overwhelm me. "Thank you, sir." The general stepped back, addressing the battalion again. "Let this serve as a reminder to every soldier present. Our strength as an army lies not in blindly following orders, but in upholding the values we are sworn to defend. Integrity is not merely a word we recite, it is the foundation upon which military service is built." He paused, scanning the formation. "Those who violated that integrity will be held accountable. Those who demonstrated it, even at personal risk, will be recognized. Corporal Jason Mitchell, Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, Specialist Thomas Chen, Lieutenant James Wilson, front and center." My heart swelled as my supporters stepped forward, lining up beside me. Each was awarded a commendation for moral courage, their willingness to stand for truth despite potential consequences publicly honored. As the ceremony concluded and the formation was dismissed, soldiers approached in small groups, some offering congratulations, others quiet apologies for not speaking up sooner. I accepted both with grace, understanding the complex dynamics at play. Mitchell stayed by my side, a steadfast presence as I navigated this surreal re-entry. "What happens now, Lieutenant?" Before I could answer, Henry appeared, his eyes shining with pride. "Well done, soldier. he said, voice rough with emotion. Well done. I introduced him to the others, watching as they realized who he was. The father of a Medal of Honor recipient, a man whose son had faced similar injustice with similar courage. The parallels weren't lost on anyone. Lieutenant Carter? A junior officer I didn't recognize approached, looking slightly uncomfortable. The general requests your presence in the command building. Immediately, if possible. Exchanging glances with Henry and Mitchell, I nodded. Of course. As I walked across the base, soldiers stopped to salute. A respect that felt earned in a way it never had before. Inside the command building, I was directed not to the general's office but to a larger conference room. When I entered, I froze in surprise. Seated around the table were not only General Phillips but also representatives from the Pentagon, the Inspector General's office, and the Army's Public Affairs Division. At the head of the table sat a woman I recognized immediately. From news coverage, the Secretary of the Army herself. Lieutenant Carter, the Secretary greeted me. Please have a seat. We have much to discuss about the future. The meeting in the command building lasted over 3 hours. What had begun as a discussion about my personal case quickly expanded into something much larger. The Secretary of the Army was direct. The situation with Colonel Stanton had exposed systemic problems that required systemic solutions. Lieutenant, your experience isn't unique, she explained, sliding a folder across the table. This contains similar cases from bases across the country. Officers, disproportionately women and minorities, pushed out through manipulated evaluations, trumped-up infractions, or commanded to fail. I flipped through the file, a sick feeling, growing in my stomach as I recognized the patterns. Different names, different bases, but the same story playing out again and again. We've allowed a culture to develop where certain commanders can act with impunity, the Secretary continued. The Army is forming a special task force to address these issues, and we want you on it. I looked up in surprise. Me? I'm just a lieutenant. A lieutenant who stood up to a corrupt system and won, General Phillips interjected. That's exactly who we need. The proposal they laid out was unexpected. I would be promoted to captain and assigned to the newly formed Integrity and Leadership Review Task Force. My role would be to help identify cases similar to mine, recommend policy changes to prevent future abuses, and assist in developing new leadership training protocols. This is more than just cleaning house, the Secretary emphasized. This is about changing the culture, building an army where moral courage is valued as highly as physical courage. It was an opportunity I had never imagined, a chance to turn my personal ordeal into something that could help others. Yet I hesitated. May I have some time to consider this? I asked. The Secretary nodded. Of course, but not too long. We want to announce the task force next week. As the meeting concluded and officials filed out, General Phillips held back. When we were alone, he said, "There's one more thing, Carter. A personal matter." He handed me another file, this one thinner than the others. "This belongs to you." Inside was a single document, a letter of commendation for David Lawson, dated 20 years earlier. It detailed actions he had taken that had saved his unit from an ambush, actions based on intelligence his commander had initially dismissed. Where did this come from? I asked, confused. It was in Colonel Stanton's personal files. He served with David Lawson in his first deployment. The commendation was drafted but never submitted. The General's expression was grim. I thought Henry should have it. I left the command building in a daze, the weight of everything, my reinstatement, the task force offer, David's commendation, pressing on me. Rather than seeking out Henry immediately, I took a solitary walk around the base, trying to sort through my thoughts. Near the edge of the training grounds, I found a quiet spot beneath a large oak tree and sat, opening the commendation again. The parallels were unmistakable. David had seen what others missed, had been ignored because of a commander's ego, and had ultimately sacrificed himself to save his team. The commendation acknowledged his courage and insight, too late for him to know it. Lieutenant Carter? I looked up to see Corporal Mitchell approaching, concern evident in his expression. Everything all right, ma'am? You've been gone for hours. I gestured for him to join me, handing him David's commendation. As he read it, understanding dawned on his face. Henry's son, this is why he helped you, isn't it? He saw himself in your story. And David in me, I said softly. History repeating itself, except this time with a different ending. Mitchell handed the document back. What will you do? About the task force position? I don't know, I admitted. Part of me wants to just return to normal duty, put all this behind me, but another part feels like I'd be wasting an opportunity to make real change. For what it's worth, ma'am, I think you'd be perfect for it. You've lived it. You understand what's at stake in a way most officers never will. His confidence in me was touching, but it also highlighted another concern. And what about the unit? The soldiers who stood by me? If I leave for this task force, what happens to them? Mitchell smiled slightly. We'll be fine, Lieutenant. What you taught us, about integrity, about standing up for what's right, that doesn't go away if you do. I considered his words as we walked back toward the administration building. By the time we reached Henry's truck, where he waited patiently, I had made my decision. There you are, Henry said, relief evident in his voice. I was getting worried. I held out David's commendation without speaking. Henry took it with questioning eyes that gradually filled with tears as he read. Where did this come from? He asked, voice barely above a whisper. Stanton had it. All these years. I explained what General Phillips had told me. He never submitted it. David never knew that someone had recognized what he did. Henry's hands trembled as he reread the document. 20 years, he murmured. 20 years I've wondered if anyone besides me understood what really happened. His vulnerability in that moment, the raw pain still evident after so many years, crystallized my decision. I couldn't walk away. Not when there were other soldiers out there facing similar injustices, other families carrying similar wounds. They've offered me a position, I told him, heading a task force to identify and address cases like mine, like David's, throughout the Army. Henry looked up from the commendation, studying my face. And you're going to take it. It wasn't a question, but I nodded anyway. I have to. Otherwise, what was all this for? The dismissal? The fight to be reinstated? It would just be about me, my career, my reputation. And you want it to be about something bigger, Henry finished for me. Yes, about changing the system that allowed it to happen in the first place. Henry carefully folded the commendation and placed it in his pocket, close to his heart. David would be proud, he said simply. As am I. The following week was a whirlwind of activity. My promotion to captain was expedited. The task force was formally established, and I began the process of transitioning from my old unit. Though excited about the new role, I felt a pang of sadness at leaving the soldiers who had stood by me. On my last day with the unit, they organized an impromptu gathering in the mess hall. Mitchell had somehow procured a cake, and Sergeant Rodriguez presented me with a unit patch mounted in a small frame, a reminder of where I had come from. Speech, someone called out, and others quickly took up the chant. I stepped forward, surveying the faces before me. Some I had known for months, others I had only truly come to know during the crucible of the past week. All had shown courage when it mattered most. I'm not good at speeches, I began, but I want you to know something. What happened to me, the dismissal, the fight to clear my name, it was never just about me. It was about all of us, about what kind of army we want to serve in. I paused, gathering my thoughts. There's a quote that's been in my mind lately. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good people to do nothing. Each of you did something. You spoke up. You stood firm. And because of that, things are changing, not just here at Fort Bragg, but throughout the Army. I gestured to my captain's bars, still new and shiny on my collar. This promotion isn't just for me. It's for all of you. For every soldier who has ever been silenced, overlooked, or pushed aside. And I promise you, in my new role, I will carry your stories with me. I will fight to build an army where integrity isn't just a word we recite, but a reality we live. The room erupted in applause, faces bright with pride and possibility. As the gathering wound down and soldiers began to disperse, Mitchell approached with Henry at his side. All set for Washington. Captain? Mitchell asked, his use of my new rank still strange to my ears. Almost. One last stop to make first. That stop was the small military cemetery just off base, where Henry had asked to visit David's grave before I left. We stood together beside the simple headstone, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the neatly maintained grounds. Henry placed David's commendation against the stone, securing it with a small rock. He knows now, he said quietly. Wherever he is, he knows. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. After a moment, Henry straightened, turning to face me directly. Emily, when I saw you in that diner, I thought God was giving me a second chance. A chance to do for you what I couldn't do for David. His eyes were clear and direct. But it wasn't about saving you. You saved yourself. You just needed someone to remind you that you could. You did more than that, I said, finding my voice. You showed me what it means to fight for what's right, even when the cost is high. You and David both. Henry smiled, a rare, full smile that transformed his weathered face. Then we're even. As we walked back to his truck, I thought about the journey ahead, the challenges of the task force, the resistance we would inevitably face, the systems that would be slow to change. It wouldn't be easy. But then, nothing worth fighting forever is. You know, Henry said as we drove away from the cemetery. When I first spoke to you in that diner and said you looked like my boy, I wasn't just talking about physical resemblance. What did you, mean? There's a kind of light some soldiers have. A clarity of purpose. David had it. You have it too. He glanced at me briefly before returning his eyes to the road. That's what they fear, you know. Men like Stanton. Not your competence, but your clarity. Your unwavering sense of right and wrong. I considered this as we drove in comfortable silence. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps what had made me a target was the very quality that had allowed me to fight back and win. That evening, as I packed my belongings for the move to Washington, I found the velvet case containing David's Medal of Honor. Henry had insisted I take it with me. Not to keep, but to hold and trust, a tangible reminder of the legacy I was now part of. I opened the case, the metal gleaming in the soft light of my temporary quarters. So much sacrifice, so much courage represented in that small piece of metal and ribbon. I thought of David, dying to save his team after being dismissed as unfit. I thought of Henry, channeling his grief into helping others. And I thought of all the soldiers out there facing similar battles, needing someone to stand up for them. Dismissed does not define you, I whispered, echoing Henry's words from that first day. Courage does. And in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that I was exactly where I needed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do, not despite having been broken, but because of it. Not despite having been dismissed, but because I had refused to accept that dismissal as the end of my story. Tomorrow, I would begin writing a new chapter. Not just for myself, but for every soldier who deserved better than what the system had given them. And I would carry with me the lesson that had brought me here, that sometimes being dismissed is just the beginning of discovering your true strength.